So not only have I been using the Vivo V23 Pro as my full-time smartphone for over a week now, I actually took it out to Iceland for a few days where the beer is surprisingly delicious and the whiskey is perhaps unsurprisingly about as smooth as a badger's taint. And while I was out there, I fully engaged tourist twat mode in order to thoroughly test one of the best features on the Vivo V23 Pro, that 108 megapixel rear camera, as well as the 50 megapixel dual selfie shooter. So here's my in-depth Vivo V23 Pro review, and for more on the latest and greatest tech and random appearances by cats, please do poke subscribe and ding that notifications bell. Cheers! So first up, I've got to say I love the skinny and light design of the V23 Pro. It is impressively thin and lightweight, to the point where occasionally I'd be like, is it even in my pocket anymore, which led to regular frantic fumbles and not the good kind. We're not quite talking Motorola Moto Edge 20 here, but it's not far off at all. That back end feels absolutely fantastic when you are clutching the phone as well. It's constructed from a textured fluorite AG glass, so it doesn't sport the usual super smooth finish you find on a lot of modern smartphones. The aesthetics are very smart indeed. I could comfortably confuse the Vivo V23 Pro for something that's twice the price rather than just a mid-range mobile. I'd rather enjoy the colour morphing effect on this Sunshine Gold model as well. Sometimes it's kind of a dusky yellow, and other times it's more like aquamarine, very funky indeed. My only real complaint as far as the design goes here on the Vivo V23 Pro is that you don't get any dedicated water resistance. But to be fair, while I was in Iceland for those few days, this thing got absolutely pelted by various hailstorms and rainstorms. No complaints whatsoever, even though it was probably cold enough to freeze a polar bear's butt. So yeah, even if you live in the northeast England, it'll probably be absolutely fine. Now moving on to software, what you got here is FunTouch OS 12 sat on top of Android 12, and like many launchers these days, this allows you to get close to a stock Android vibe while also adding in plenty of decent bonus features. So for instance, dive into the settings and you'll discover a respectable amount of customization in there, especially when it comes to the various launcher animations, which on the whole are fluid and rather pleasing to the peepers. You've also got a one-handed mode, thank God, as well, because the Vivo V23 Pro is a bit on the big side. And yeah, the one-handed mode is rather awkward to activate, but it definitely does the job. There's plenty of gesture shortcuts to open up your favorite apps. You can also shake the Vivo V23 Pro to turn on that torch, although you can furiously pump it as much as you like, but it won't turn off again. And it's also great to see that Vivo doesn't load its smartphones with all kinds of crapware, which some manufacturers, like some Xiaomi for instance, are definitely guilty of. On here you will find a few little bits, but they're generally inoffensive and some of them are actually quite useful. It's definitely good that Vivo doesn't load this thing with all kinds of apps that you can't delete, because you've got a choice of either 128 or 256 gigs of storage, plenty of space you would think, but there's no expandability via micro SD. And overall, I've got to say, I did enjoy the FunTouch experience, so to speak, although there were a couple of little bugs here and there. So for instance, one day I did notice when I was trying to type out an email, the keyboard was really sluggish and unresponsive to the point where I'd tap a key and it would take a good 2 or 3 seconds for it to actually pop up on the screen. I did try shutting down various apps and services. I rebooted the phone, nothing seemed to work, and then the problem just magically corrected itself about an hour later. I also noticed a problem when I was streaming video on the likes of Netflix or Disney Plus, where sometimes I would start up a show or a movie, and for the first minute or so, the performance was a little bit judgery. Occasionally there'd be little frame skips and things like that. Generally only happened for about a minute or so, and then tempered itself down. It was absolutely fine again, but quite awkward and annoying for that minute. But anyway, if you're intrigued and you want a bit more of a proper tour of a FunTouch, well, definitely go check out my full in-depth Vivo V23 Pro unboxing, where I also compare it with its cheaper sibling, the Vivo V23. Yeah, I was definitely a fan of that in-display fingerprint sensor as well. On the whole, quite dependable, although if my fingers were quite moist or grubby, then all of a sudden, yeah, it did fail more often than not. So now let's have a shufty at that 6.56-inch AMOLED display. Now this just curves ever so gently around the edges, but thankfully I had absolutely no issues with palm intrusion and the general responsiveness of the screen, even when I was clutching it quite tight. The visuals are typically strong. You got full HD plus resolution here with full HDR10 plus support. You've got nice sharp contrast, while that color output is fully customizable as well. You can temper it down or you can have it really slap you in the face, bright and vibrant. Yes, you do have a wide boy notch stuck away up top, which intrudes on your full screen shenanigans, but at least it's not quite as ridiculous a mustache notch like on those iPhones. You still got plenty of room for notification icons and the rest of that. The auto brightness was generally dependable here on the Vivo V23 Pro as well. There were a couple of moments where it went a little bit darker than I could have possibly needed. I'd have to manually tweak the brightness instead. But overall, not bad at all. And on that peak brightness, you'll have absolutely no trouble seeing what's going on, even in bright daylight. Don't bite me, you little you vicious git. I'm not giving you enough strokes on my mate, sorry. And as for the refresh rate, well, I can dynamically switch here on the Vivo V23 Pro between 60 to 90 Hz, and at that 90 Hz level, it is a lovely, silky smooth experience. The audio chops, unfortunately, aren't quite as impressive. It's a mono speaker setup, and it's a bit crap, to be perfectly honest. You've got no headphone jack on here either, just like with a lot of flagship smartphones, but at least the Bluetooth 5.2 connectivity worked like a charm. Now, as for the performance here on the Vivo V23 Pro, well, it's powered by MediaTek's Dimensity 1200 chipset, just like the OnePlus Nord 2, and that's backed by a very generous 12 gigs of RAM. I did see the occasional little judder again here and there just in everyday running. Sometimes the animations weren't quite as smooth just for a moment, but generally that was when I had lots of apps on the go at once. And certainly, if you want to do a good bit of gaming, well, no worries on that front. Like the Genshin Impact run absolutely fine, even if you try to boost the detail settings a little bit. You've got the dedicated gaming mode, which can help you to block notifications. You've also got a dedicated performance mode on there, just to make sure that your game gets all the resources it needs. And I found that even if I wanted to play Genshin Impact for a good hour or so, well, generally the Vivo V23 Pro didn't run too hot. It absolutely managed to cope with it just fine. And of course, like pretty much every smartphone around this sort of price point these days, you've got full 5G support. It's actually 5G support across both SIM slots as well, if you do want to pack 2 SIMs in there at once. As for the battery tech, well, it's a 4,300 mAh cell stuffed inside of the Vivo V23 Pro. Not as big as some rivals, but it absolutely did the job perfectly. I found that even on the busiest, longest days with lots of intensive use, I'm talking a lot of camera play, lots of video recording, all of that good stuff, I still ended up with around 10 to 15% at the end of that day. And on those days where I took it a bit easier, just, you know, your general messaging, web browsing, all of that sort of good stuff, I generally ended up with around 40 to 50% battery at the end of that day. So you could happily have this thing last an entire weekend if you didn't go crazy. And when you are running low on juice, you've got 44-watt recharging speeds here, as long as you've got a cable. Unfortunately, there's no wireless charging support on here. Now, one of the big whoops with the Vivo V23 Pro is that 108 megapixel primary camera sensor, which is a bit of a stunner for capturing everyday snaps and home movies. You don't end up with massive 108 meg pics, as the V23 uses 9-in-1 pixel binning to produce 12 megapixel results. And that is more than enough detail for a crisp, good looking image when you check them out on a telly or a monitor. I found that my test shots with this camera boasted some impressive colour reproduction, so photos do actually look natural as long as the lighting isn't terrible. Even indoor snaps look close to what you'll see in real life, with the occasional bulky skin tones. Moving subjects are often cleanly captured, although I did get some blur when snapping in more ambient light, so you will need a steady hand and an even steadier subject. And I really like the portrait mode's fake bokeh style effect, which can be tinkered within the settings. HDR situations are generally well handled too, although come nighttime I did see some considerable grain creeping in at times, even with that night mode active. An alternative 8 megapixel ultra-wide angle shooter can be swapped to at any point if you can't quite fit everything into frame, although this suffers from the usual ultra-wide angle tropes, pumping out darker shots with a distinctive loss of colour accuracy. But if you've got a well-lit scenario, it works fine. It's just a shame that it's a compromise as usual. And the final lens on this triple lens rear shooter is your bog standard basic 2 megapixel macro f. It's pretty standard fare. So home movies and video can be shot at up to 4K resolution at either 30 frames per second or 60 if you fancy a smoother, more natural result. Some kind of wind filter would have definitely helped my outdoor Iceland clips, as my expert commentary on the natural land formations was almost entirely obliterated by all those gusty shenanigans. But the picture quality is strong and stabilization is only a little bit juddery when you're moving and shooting at the same time. You also have a special night mode when you're shooting video in darker conditions, if that's your bag. Another highlight is the 50 megapixel dual selfie cam up front, which comes packing full autofocus to keep you nice and crisp. And again, the results are strong as long as you don't shoot against strong light, in which case your pics may appear rather washed out. Still, the dual tone spotlight feature can illuminate your face in the dark with a combination of 2 bright LEDs and a bright white screen. And this works really well for shooting a late night selfie with other junk going on in the background. You can also shoot a bit of 4K video using that front-facing camera setup as well, which is perfectly fine for a bit of professional style vlogging, although albeit with the usual audio capture issues. About 3 stars. So if you're outdoors, you'll want to definitely speak up quite a bit. So that right there is my full, final, frank Vivo V23 Pro smartphone review. And I've got to say, I did enjoy using it as my full-time handset, despite the fact there are a couple of little issues lurking in there. But certainly the highlight here is that camera tech, especially if you're a selfie aficionado. So if you're looking for something to take on the likes of the Pixel 4a and the 5a at that mid-range price point, we'll definitely give it a squint. So what do you reckon, and are you tempted? It'd be great to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. As I say, I've done a full unboxing and comparison with the standard V23 as well, if you fancy maybe shaving a bit extra off the price. And for more on the latest and greatest tech, please do plug subscribe, ding that notifications bell, and have yourselves a bloody lovely rest of the week. Cheers everyone, love you.